Do Christians really have to tithe? We are examining 10 important points, and this is number 8. The apostles never taught Christians to tithe. One of the most important observations, the strongest by the way of all, is that the apostles never restated any of the New Testament commandments as binding requirements for New Testament believers. Numerous practices that were commanded in the law of Moses simply do not reappear as obligations for the church, and among these is tithing. Tithing appears only briefly in the book of Hebrews chapter 7. I'm talking about after the death of Jesus Christ, because the other only time Jesus mentioned about tithing, Matthew 23, he was simply clarifying something to those who were observing the law. The Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, who were neglecting the weightier matters of the heart, yet they were actually doing some of these smaller things because they were commanded. But in the epistle to the Hebrews in chapter 7, tithing is mentioned in a historical and theological discussion about Abraham and the priesthood. This letter to the Hebrews was written primarily to the Jewish believers, the descendants of Abraham, who lived under the old covenant and were struggling with the question of whether Jesus was truly the Messiah. So the writers of the book of Hebrews are explaining that the old Levitical priesthood was fulfilled and surpassed by Jesus Christ. So by default, the early church understood that many, in fact most of all the things that were being required of the Israelites under the old covenant had been fulfilled through the once and for all sacrifice of Jesus Christ. As a result, several formal restrictions simply disappeared without needing formal announcements that they had ended. For example, ceremonial restrictions that once limited participation in public worship, such as those concerning bodily conditions, are never mentioned or reaffirmed in the New Testament. And likewise, foods that were once considered unclean are now declared clean. Whenever a practice was controversial for the early church, it was openly debated and clarified. A clear example is circumcision, which became such a major dispute that the apostles and elders had to gather to deliberate on it at the Council of Jerusalem. And if tithing had been intended as a binding requirement for Christians, it would likely have appeared in similar discussions. But we don't see tithing being mentioned anywhere in such debates or disputes. So tithing was not debated or commanded or imposed on the church. The apostles consistently taught a different model of giving, one based on willingness and generosity rather than obligation. So believers were encouraged to give voluntarily according to what they had decided in their hearts, rather than under the requirement of a fixed system. We see that the apostles wrote many instructions to the church. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul talks about the order of service, trying to clear some of the problems that were in the church. So he instructed the congregation on how worship goes, but we don't see anything concerning the practice of tithing. In some other places, Apostle Paul and others would occasionally talk about collections, church collections, collecting money or items for aid to help other saints from distant places and other churches. For example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, which I love very much, talks about free will offering amidst persecution and great suffering. It says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflown in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints." Even giving freely to the saints was not being required of them. They approached the apostles on their own and asked to take part. This is beautiful. So the apostles never forced these people to give, and therefore we see generosity as a fruit of the Spirit in them. Verse 6 says that accordingly we urged Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. The act of giving that is mentioned here is of grace, not a commandment, not from the law of Moses, and it has nothing to do with being forced to give simply because you're a Christian. And verse 12, for example, says that, for if readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their needs, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. And this goes on to chapter 9, for example, in verse 6, 7, 8, which say, the point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in their heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. This is really beautiful. If there was anything like tithing, if there was any part of of giving that was compulsory, that rested on percentages such as tithing, Paul would have mentioned it here. But we don't see that happening. And he actually clarifies that it is by God's grace that we give. He says that grace abounds and it makes us to do every good work. So whatever we do, even if we give freely, it has nothing to do with our performance. All glory goes back to God. There are many places like 1 Corinthians chapter 16, which says that now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collection will have to be made. Then, when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. So not only did church members collect willingly, but there was also transparency. Church members collected voluntarily, and in many cases we see Paul delegating and also sending witnesses to be sure that the things which were collected were delivered to where they were supposed to be sent. And this is not the case in today's church, where money is collected, but there's no accountability. So in the Bible, in the early church, giving was voluntary, it was proportional, and it was cheerful. People gave happily, no percentages, no fixed amounts of money were required of them. So, in my conclusion, if tithing were essential for the church, the apostles would have clearly taught it. If they needed money, a financial system to run the church as we claim today, this would have been established clearly in places such as 1 Corinthians chapter 14. We would be seeing scriptures explaining who is in charge of money and what the money is supposed to do. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with point number 9. Thank you for being with me on this journey. Bye-bye.